Hello everyone, I'm Ray Lemuel Algoso. I will be reporting about behavioral analysis by B.F. Skinner. So we're gonna be tackling about the what, where, who, when, why, and everything. So to start, let's start with the overview of behavioral analysis. So during the early years of 20th century, while Freud, Jung, and Adler were relying on clinical practice, and before Eysenck and Costa and McRae were using psychometrics to build theories of human personality, an approach called behaviorism, in which it is believed that a person is passive and simply responds to environmental stimuli through conditioning, emerged. And two of the early pioneers or the proponents of this approach were E.L. Thorndike and John B. Watson. But the person most often associated with the behaviorist position is B.F. Skinner. So, according to B.F. Skinner, he minimized speculation and focused almost entirely on observable behavior. However, he did not claim that observable behavior is limited to external events, such as thinking, remembering, and anticipating. Uh, these private behaviors in which the person experience are, are not limited to external events or limited to external events. So Skinner's strict adherence to observable behavior earned his approach the label radical behaviorism. So when we say radical, it's comprehensive, or it talks about the entirety of a certain thing. So it is a doctrine that avoids all hypothetical constructs such as ego, traits, drives, needs, and hunger. So, um, B.F. Skinner was also regarded as a determinist. Why? Um, a determinist, which falls under determinism, the determinist approach proposes that all behavior has a cause and is thus predictable. And he also rejected the notion of volition or free will, because free will in determinism is an illusion, and our behavior is governed by internal or external forces over which we have no control. So we have no control about the internal or external forces around us, and free will is just a mere illusion. So another determinist in which they regarded him is external determinism or environmentalist. Why? Because according to B.F. Skinner, psychology must not explain behavior on the basis of the physiological or constitutional components of the organism, but rather on the environmental stimuli. Because an environmentalist sees the cause of behavior as being outside the individual, like parental influence, the media, school, and others. So example for this is Bandura's social learning theory, di ba? So in Bandura's social learning theory, it showed that children become more aggressive through observation and imitation of their violent parents. So next, we're gonna be talking about the biography of B.F. Skinner. So B.F. Skinner, because his name is Burrus Frederick Skinner, and he was born on March 20th, 1904 in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania in the United States. So he is a son of a lawyer and housewife. Skinner had a warm and stable childhood and was left with plenty of time for creativity and invention, in which the two traits that would serve him well throughout his career. He also graduated from Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, in 1926. Skinner originally set his sights on becoming a writer. So it was while working as a bookstore clerk in New York City that Skinner discovered the works of John B. Watson and Ivan Pavlov. So which so fascinated him that he put his plans of becoming a novelist to the side and decided to pursue a career in psychology. So when Skinner was a 24-year-old man, he enrolled in the psychology department of Harvard University and began his studies under William Crozier. So William Crozier is the chair of the new psychology department at that time. Though not himself a psychologist, Crozier was interested in studying the behavior of animals as a whole, an approach that was different than the approaches that psychologists and physiologists took at the time. Instead of trying to figure out all of the processes that were occurring inside the animal, Crozier and subsequently Skinner was more interested in the animal's overall behavior. Crozier's ideology matched perfectly with the work that Skinner wished to pursue. He was interested in learning how behavior was related to experimental conditions. Now, we're going to talk about precursors to scientific behaviorism. So the first psychologist to systematically study the consequences of behavior was Edward D. Thorndike. And law of effect, that is also a precursor to scientific behaviorism. John B. Watson's work was the second and more direct influence on Skinner. So the law of effect, that is, Thorndike observed that learning takes place mostly because of the effects that follow a response, and he called that observation the law of effect. So originally, conceived by Thorndike, the law of effect had two parts. So the first stated that the responses to stimuli that are followed immediately by a satisfier tend to be stamped in. So the second held that the responses to stimuli that are followed immediately by an annoyer tend to be stamped out. So the first one, by a satisfier, tend to be stamped in, and the second one, followed immediately by an annoyer, tend to be stamped out. So satisfier stamped in as to annoyer stamped out. So scientific behaviorism holds that behavior can be studied without reference to needs, instincts, or motives, because Skinner insisted that human behavior should be studied scientifically. Like, not more on theories or instincts or motives, but scientifically. We should study the human behavior. And explaining human behavior is like associating our free will to natural phenomena. But like, free will is in nature of a person. So just like you have the discretion to do things, decide things, whether it is bad or good, and you relate it to natural phenomena. Next, we have philosophy of science. So in scientific behaviorism, it allows for an interpretation of behavior but not an explanation of its causes. The interpretation permits the scientist to generalize from a simple learning condition to a more complex one. So, conceptualizing from simple to complex ideas. That is the philosophy of science. For example, Skinner generalized from animal studies to children and then to adults. So, that is how he philosophized science. And Skinner has this characteristic of science as well. So, according to him, it has three main characteristics. First, science is cumulative. Second, it is an attitude that values empirical observation. And third, science is a search for order and lawful relationships. So, first, why science is cumulative? So, studies like physics or chemistry in today's high school is far way more complicated than those educated Greeks 2,000 years ago. So, diba, like, um, learning is also cumulative as like just like knowledge as well as science. So, they're all interrelated as well. So, every day we discover new things. So, it adds to the pile of knowledge to science. That's why it is called cumulative. And science is unique not because of technology but rather because of its attitude. Diba? Um, Science is cutting edge. Diba? Like um, s- science can't be the same for humanities. Diba? The wisdom and genius of Plato, Michelangelo, and Shakespeare are clearly not inferior to the wisdom and genius of any modern philosopher, artist, or writer. So we can just compare Plato to Elon Musk. Diba? We can't just compare um, Michelangelo to Kublai Milan. But like because science is cumulative and so over time new knowledge comes to every aspect of science. So like madungagan ang ideas. So the scope of science gets larger and larger as days goes by. Over time, every fraction of time. Next, science is an attitude that values empirical observation. So what do we mean by empirical? So it is based on observation or very verifiable by observation. And because it is disposition to deal with facts rather than with what someone has said about them. So it values empirical observation. Dili lang kay Surya that nag-ulan tungod kay nagluha ang mga anghel sa langit. It's not like that. It has a scientific explanation, di ba? And there are three components to the scientific attitude. First, it rejects authority, demands intellectual honesty, and then suspends judgment. Why it rejects authority? Because science even rejects its own authority, di ba? Just because some well-respected person, such as Einstein, says something that in itself does not make the statement true, it must stand the test of empirical observation. Diba? And second, science demands intellectual honesty. It requires scientists to accept facts even when these facts are opposed to their wishes and desires. Diba, like the scientists have to accept facts even if it's against their own belief. Diba, like it's part of the attitude of science. like how a certain concept breaks your thinking pattern. Next, um, uh, suspense judgment. Science is an attitude that follows empirical observation. Three components. The last you have it suspends judgment. Science suspends judgment until clear trends emerge. So nothing is more damaging to a scientist's reputation than to rush into print findings that are insufficiently verified and tested. So, like, if a scientist's report of findings does not hold up to replication, then that certain scientist appears foolish at best and dishonest at worst. Kaya wala man siyang makitang makareplicate sa kanyang findings. So, being skeptical and willingly to suspend judgment are therefore essential to being a scientist. So, healthy skepticism contributes to being a good scientist. The last, we have science is a search for order and lawful relationships. Why? Because all science begins with observation of single events and then attempts to infer general principles and laws from those events. So, for short, the scientific method consists of prediction, control, and description. A scientist makes observations guided by theoretical assumptions, then develops hypotheses, diba? Then they make predictions. Then they test these hypotheses through controlled experimentation. After that, they describe honestly and accurately the results, and finally modifies the theory to match the actual empirical results. So this circular relationship between theory and research is very essential. So Skinner devoted much of his time trying to discover such conditions using a procedure called operant conditioning. So operant conditioning will be discussed by the next reporter. And that is my report for this chapter. Thank you for listening.